Welcome, comedy fans. We are here to detect the marvelous, and today we're going to talk about how Alpha Flight fights alpha male stereotypes and perspectives. In a weird way, I really tried to shoehorn in that metaphor there, but without further ado, so I am your host, Dan Rosen, but I have two other hosts here with me who are great. We all detect the marvelous together with Shahara Ghaznavi and Matthew Ardle. How are you guys doing?
Great. Awesome. Yeah. Excited to talk Alpha Flight. This was one of my favorite comics as a kid.
It's cool. I actually I feel ashamed as a Canadian comedy fan. I didn't really read much Alpha Flight unless he came afoul Wolverine. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I went back and I started just for the fun of it. I read the first couple of the introduction of Alpha Flight in the X-Men universe. And the first, I went to Florida and I found the first 40 issues for like $2. So I came
Oh,
back
nice.
with like and they're in pretty good condition, not mint, but close. And I had to there's one or two issues missing that I picked up off of eBay. But it's funny, I had to go to Florida to get the only Canadian comic book in the Marvel universe.
Yeah,
So,
that's funny.
yeah.
I didn't even realize that like a sick Canadian in to my knowledge Scott Lobdell is American, right? But it's a Canadian. I don't what or maybe I'm wrong about that.
I was actually confused about that as well because the creator of Alpha Flight is
Matt's checking his Cerebro Batman supercomputer.
Yeah.
But as Matt's doing that, I didn't realize that there was such a prominent Canadian presence in the X-Men universe, other than the Wolverine. But I thought that the Wolverine was going to be like the only one. But to see that there was
Yeah, I grew up
Yeah.
thinking Wolverine was the only one, and then all of a sudden there's a Wolverine issue where Alpha Flight just bursts out the ground and be like, "Hey, Wolverine, stop right there!" And then
Yeah, so it's John Byrne. So John Byrne created them. Um he lived in Alberta. So he's British, moved to America, spent his youth in it's created by a Canadian American Brit kind of thing, so kind of a
right.
mix and match. But yeah. So I'll get into that a bit about in my trivia that I have for later. But
Nice.
yeah. So now I'll edit that so it's much tighter, so we don't need to worry about the box.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect.
Yeah. No. So it's true. It's such a weird. They're kind of introduced as villains, and then they got popular as not villains, but like a foil to Wolverine to kind of explain his mysterious backstory.
Yeah.
And then it kept getting fleshed out. But yeah, and if you go back and read those, there's like the very first Alpha Flight. Pierre Elliott Trudeau isn't presented in the most kind of ways, kind of
Oh,
like an
interesting.
officious politician jerk kind of thing. Which that John Byrne grew up in Alberta makes a lot of sense. But yeah.
But I mean, it is interesting because this was a very progressive, I feel like, for its time kind of comic book. But I guess a lot of comic book stories, one of the things is comics, the best ones were kind of, a little ahead of their time or very forward thinking, given whatever the reflection was of the times.
Well, I mean, the thing is too is John, who created them, wanted. I mean, we're going to be getting this is another Pride episode, so we're going to be getting into Northstar. But he wanted him to be gay from day one, but he wasn't allowed. So it was only 106 issues in the mid 90s that they were allowed the right, and he had already quit because he didn't even want to make these characters, but they're like, we'll give you your own title if you take these characters that you made and make them spin off in their own series. And all right.
Yeah.
But yeah, like
Yeah.
there's like lots of scenes over the course of Alpha Flight where like they'll call Northstar's home, and because he's like an Olympic skier and for
Yeah.
some reason rich. I don't know. Canadian Olympic skiers are not rich. I have friends who are friends with Olympians. Um, they live
He's got
probably lifestyles not as fun as mine. Let me
he's
put it
got
that way.
8-figure contract with Burton Skis that'll
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
yeah for
But yeah, so he has a mansion and there's a pool inside and there's always like a half naked man swimming kind of thing. And it's like,
right. Yeah.
he's the most an eligible bachelor. So
Right.
it's lots of very code
That was
for
the euphemism of the times.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
And it also, I will say, this is like so Canadian because there's like a Mountie, a North Star,
Major Maple Leaf, which
and
was like the Canadian Mountie with
yeah,
who ends up
that's right.
coming back to beat the shit out of Northstar afterwards because his son and we'll talk about this afterwards, but oh, you guys are frozen. Can you guys hear? No, you're not. Oh,
Oh yeah, we can hear you.
you
We
We
can
can
hear
hear
you.
you.
you guys are
You're
just
very
being
still.
so
Very
Yeah,
still.
we were just so
You're
we were so
enraptured by
enraptured
your
with what
words.
you were saying that we didn't move a
I think
muscle.
he's that
You're
good of a
captivated.
storyteller that I no no we meet Major Maple Leaf and we learn that his son um passed away because of AIDS and comes back to kind of be like, hey, North Star, like what you're
That's
doing is
right.
we'll talk about this afterwards, but that it was
Yeah.
Major
Yeah.
Maple Leaf was kind of a it's this is the first time we see him, like this is the first issue that Major Maple Leaf becomes a character. And then his son later
Hmm.
becomes a member of Alpha Flight in Alpha Flight Volume 3. Um, so
Oh.
we do end up meeting his son, but who's Louis Sadler Jr. Uh,
Mhm.
Yeah. Louis Sadler Jr. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny though because Major Maple Leaf in the first two X-Men issues, um, so this issue takes up after Guardian. I think he's dead in this. Um, so technically, the original guy who founded like is some uh John Hudson or something like that. He is the distant cousin of
mm,
Wolverine.
Oh.
And is related to the Hudson family of Hudson Bay Company,
Yeah.
which is like okay, you're just really pulling Canadianisms out here.
Yeah,
Like this is
someone
kind
just
of
like
like,
went through the
you're like
Encyclopedia Britannica and
what's
looked up
something
Canada
Canadian I can put in
references.
this comic book?
Yeah,
Hudson
and he
Bay
wears
Company.
beaver pelts, and he like yeah,
But they called him Major Maple because he has that power armor that's just basically a big red maple leaf across his
yeah,
chest, like in silhouette, and they just kept calling him Major Maple Leaf as an
mm.
insult. And then they turn in this comic they create a character from those early episodes where they're
yeah.
just making fun of him.
Yeah, because there's a Wolverine issue where the first time I saw Alpha Flight, like where he like surprises Wolverine, and then Banshee comes to defend Wolverine, and like flies at him and goes like, "Oh, and you Major Maple Leaf or whatever you call yourself," and I was like, that
Yeah.
feels like the closest to like a Canadian slur as like there can be, like.
You syrup suckers.
Yeah, yeah. It's like, hey, you take that back. That's
That's
yeah.
for us to say.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Only we can say that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, but
Yeah.
yeah, so do you want to give us a bit of a history
Yeah, I mean,
lesson,
honestly,
Shara?
like this whole
Yeah.
conversation covered a lot of it. So I'll start with like the basic stuff. So Alpha Flight 106 specifically was written by Scott Lobdell, penciled by Mark. Here now I'm going to be doing the attendance order thing where it's like, oh, I'm going to mispronounce all of these. Um, Mark
Yeah.
Casella, inker, or the inking is by Dan Panosian. The colorist is Bob Sharon, letterer Janice Chiang, and editors Bobby Chase and Chris Cooper. And remember the name Chris Cooper. Um, it was released on January 14th, 1992. And yeah, it takes place in Toronto, and I liked that when I read the comic book, there were Torontonian places like Rosedale and the Toronto General Hospital. Yeah, and that
Yeah.
Although they did get the skyline wrong, because when they were bursting out of the roof of Toronto General Hospital, I was like, wait a second, that's not the side of the CN Tower that the Sky Dome should be on.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But I was still impressed.
it
They
was
had them.
There was this period in the 90s where there was all of a sudden so many like Canada references. Like there was like a Spider-Man issue where he helps out like the Montreal Expos in the early 90s, and like where he's with hanging out with the Blue Jays for like a
what?
4-part series and stuff.
Yeah, but because we won the World Series and all of a sudden we mattered. That's why.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And after winning it twice, we never mattered again.
And we
That's right.
still
Yeah.
don't.
Yeah.
This is a cool issue because it features Northstars coming out. And also
Hmm.
he adopts a baby that um is we learn has AIDS, and that's kind of what this comic is framed in, and knowing what time it was made, or like what time it was commenting on, at least um was like the AIDS
Hmm.
crisis. And um Chris Cooper, the editor that I told you to remember the name of, he was working on one Alpha Flight 106, and they got the first call from a comic book store being like, "Hey, like, is Northstar actually gonna come out in this one?" And he was like, "Yeah, like we're gonna do it." And suddenly they had like urgent calls to like make six more and then make six more. And I believe that Alpha Flight, and I have it
Wow.
here, that I think Alpha Flight um sold out in a week. Alpha Flight 106 in a week.
Oh wow.
Um and it wasn't a very popular title, but I guess it had something that people wanted, right? A high demand. And it is
Yeah.
the only comic book issue to have been inducted into the Galactic Hall of Fame, or Gay
Gay Galactic.
Galactic.
Galactic
Nice.
Galactic.
Hall
Yeah.
of Fame.
Galactic. Yeah. An important pun to
That is the
yeah.
important part of that title. Um, yeah, and it was
Yeah. That's cool because sorry, I just want to say because like when you said like oh like they're like oh is he going to come out, like that could have gone two different ways. You'd be like all right, like either we refuse to sell, or it's like no, we need more issues, we're gonna like make sure this
oh
flies off the
yeah, and
shelves. So I'm
like,
glad it
as
went that
Matt
way.
said, like, Byrne always wanted his character to be gay, right? But he was restricted because um I
Yeah.
think it was like the Marvel editor in chief at the time, Jim Shooter. He had a policy against openly
Mhm.
homosexual characters. Womp
Yeah.
womp. And also,
I think in general with the arts,
it was
because like it wasn't like in film, it wasn't until
it was like the
Philadelphia.
Comics Code of Authority, like that literally had a thing against it.
Right.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just Jim Shooter; it was also the Comics Code of Authority. So that
Mm,
a lot of
Yeah.
restrictions. And so yeah, it was controversial, but um and I think afterwards, like, no mention was made of his sexual orientation for like the remainder of the Alpha Flight series. And it ended with issue 130 in 1994. Um, and yeah, so,
right. Oh, so yeah, a
yeah, a
couple
couple
years
years later. So
later.
this is kind of the
Yeah.
most outright that we
I
get it.
y- don't think he was like, 'cause, like that's around when I was reading it. I don't think he was a member anymore at that point too. Like he drifted off. Like he and Aurora stopped, and it was like Purple Girl and Box. Like it was a different team.
Yeah.
Um, so Purple Girl is a scary character because she's the daughter of Purple Man, who's the
Oh,
villain from the
Mhm.
Jessica Jones show.
I did not
So
realize there was a whole purple family.
there's a purple family, and they
Oh,
can
is
mind
that
control
like
you with
Kilgrave and stuff?
pheromones.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
this Kilgrave's daughter. His daughter was a
oh,
member of Alpha
jeez,
Flight.
actually, that's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Oh wow. This is like when you.
Like,
This is like funny. I was like, oh no, like when you find out someone you like and that like their parents like fought, their like dad like fought for the Nazis or something like that. It's like no, but I
Yeah,
love
but
this
Kilgrave
person,
was a
and then it's
really
like,
bad character. Like
oh yeah, no, he's a
yeah.
very sinister villain. I thought he was
oh
fantastic
yeah,
in Jessica
David
Jones.
Tennant.
Yeah,
Um,
Yeah,
yeah, oh
David
for
Tennant.
sure.
yeah,
Back to Doctor Who.
Yeah, yeah.
daughter
Um,
was meant to be a villain in Alpha Flight, or was she like a
she wasn't a villain.
okay?
She was a good guy. she was
Yeah.
fighting. She went against her dad
That's
and
awesome.
was a good guy. So yeah,
Wow.
yeah. So while we're talking trivia, before we get into a couple of things, like so I went back and I read they printed whatever letters came in after this, which included um like there was a letter, and you can find it on Reddit. There are some letters praising the move.
Mm.
One was ha- very
Mm.
hateful, and I am going to name and shame David Lane, Imperial Cyclops, Knight of the KKK, and it included his post
What?
office box in Halifax. Dude,
Nova Scotia?
in Halifax, Nova
Uh,
Scotia. So a KKK Imperial Cyclops put his name with his KKK, and I'm like, if you're pissing off the KKK, then you're probably doing something right. And
yeah, yeah,
and immediately under, I kind of think it was like a fuck you to this guy, because then immediately underneath that they put a letter by somebody from
Mm.
GLAD who was
mm,
praising the issue. So it's sort of like,
yeah,
these are the people who are against it, but these are the people who are for it. Which
yeah,
side are you on? Think very
yeah. Like
carefully
what
about
you
your
think?
answer,
Yeah,
kind of thing.
for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Remember,
So
Cyclops is like pro LGBTQ, but Imperial Cyclops is not. Yeah.
no, no, yeah, yeah,
But yeah, that's wild. But it's also like that's back when like you couldn't just tweet about it. You had to like really like you had to write in a letter. I'm gonna get postage stamps. I'm gonna like I'm gonna make sure I like like send it in that
That's
way kind of
an
thing.
effort to
and I
hate,
mean
you know?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
You
yeah,
had to put in the work, and I mean, like that's the thing though. People are like, "Oh, fandoms, oh, it's so toxic." I'm like, nowadays, and it's like, no, it's always been toxic. I
yeah,
mean, there are some off the hook letter sections in these comics. They
yeah,
are
yeah,
bonkers. But yeah, at least you had to, like you said, you had to put in effort. Like now, it's just
yeah.
clickety clack, or not even that, like thumb, 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 thumb.
Yeah, because usually back
Um,
then people would be like, it'd just be like, you'd read it and they'd be like, I don't like it. And then you'd say to your other like fellow white supremacists, we don't like it. Like,
yeah, and then move on with your life.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
but cool. So yeah, I guess, do you guys want to hear a recap of this story for the
Please.
audience?
yeah, we'll get in now. Let's talk.
Okay, so we open with Louis Sadler Jr., Canada's Captain America, watching recordings about his history. He fought in the golden age of timely and Atlas characters with Captain America, Namor, and the original Human Torch. Although he really didn't, he was completely made up for the first time in this issue. Um, but they kind of retconned him in. He's old and living in a messy condo that, I am sorry, even in the 1980s, that would be like a $5 million condo if that's your
Right?
living
Yeah.
room. But he's watching a CBC documentary recapping his life, and then um, it cuts to a point where he sees him retiring, and because he has a kid now, and he smashes his TV, and you see him hugging the TV, and so, oh no, doesn't smash the TV yet, but he is hugging the TV and sobbing. So
Hmm.
there's something going on there. We then cut to Alpha Flight fighting the villain, a Fantastic Four villain, Mr. Hyde,
Hmm.
one of the masters of evil. He decided to pop across the border for a
Mhm.
little light crime, as Americans are wont to do. A little shopping. The dollar is good.
Yeah, that's
Um,
right. Yeah,
yeah,
steal
honestly,
that
like
good dollar.
they've done their research when you have like Sasquatch quipping about how Canada is disrespected by Americans, and that is pure uncut Canadiana right there.
That's right.
We've been feeling disrespected since 1812. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Um, but during the battle, Northstar finds a baby abandoned in a garbage can, and retreats from the battle using his super speed to get the child to a hospital to seek care. The battle is won in a single blow, and as Guard points out, like, why didn't you do that at the top? And Sasquatch is being a little bit misogynist. Nag, nag, nag. I mean, you shouldn't say that.
Hmm.
That's not good. But then we cut to the debriefing where Wolverine's buddy Puck is smoking a stogie in Toronto because all of Wolverine's friends smoke stogies, and this was the '90s
Yeah.
when you could smoke inside of a
Yeah.
hospital.
Yeah,
Uh,
see?
yeah. Um, what follows is we find out that the child has AIDS and appears to have been abandoned by their mother, which hits Northstar and Aurora hard because they were both orphans, and they were actually separated by adoption. So the team goes silent, and we have a touching moment with Northstar, his hand pressed against the incubator, mirroring Major Maple Leaf's sobbing over the TV a few pages earlier. We see a series of frames as the team attempts to give the child a life. We find out that the mother was an unhoused person who's passed away, and the team attend the memorial, and North Star adopts the child. We next see Major Maple Leaf smashing his TV in fury. It's not explained why at that point, but it soon becomes clear because he smashes through the hospital wall and threatens to kill the child, because he's angry that Montreal's most eligible bachelor, quote unquote, is adopting this child and has become a media spectacle. Um, so this obviously doesn't rest well with North Star. They go flying into the air, fighting, and as I mentioned earlier, CN Tower is on the wrong side of the Sky Dome as they smash through that roof. I only know that because I can see it through my window. Um, and we have a back and forth. I don't know if there was a giant Avon sign. I don't remember there being a giant Avon sign in the mid 90s. I was living here then. I don't remember that. There were lots of giant signs. I miss the giant signs. I do have to
That's
say.
true. Yeah, there used to be so many giant signs.
Yeah, like Sam's the Record Man sign, just not the
Oh,
same.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah, just
absolutely.
not the same without it. Um, but yeah, it's funny. The only big sign that's survived from that era is the One Last Strip Club on Yonge Street.
Oh, right.
That's it.
The
That's it.
Zanzibar sign, right?
Yeah,
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 that's
that's
right.
it.
Which you
So,
see in The Incredible Hulk because
yes, in
Abomination
quote
throws Hulk.
unquote Harlem. Yes,
Right,
yeah.
yeah, and then I saw like he throws Hulk into it, and I see the Zanzibar sign crash down, and I'm like, wait a minute, that's Toronto. I know that
Yeah,
sign.
yeah.
Yeah.
But
I
yeah,
mean,
so they're
I've never
fighting
been there,
over.
but no.
No, I only know it because I went to Ryerson and had to walk by it.
Yeah, yeah,
Actually, it's true. I've never been in. So, yeah.
yeah.
But yeah, so we see this fight, and over the course of the fight, you know, we find out that Major Maple Leaf isn't angry because of the child, like the North Star adopting the child, but he's angry because his son died of AIDS as a gay man and nobody cared. But this child has AIDS
Mhm.
and everybody's going out of their way to make a spectacle and to
Right.
support. And at this point, and this is again 92, this was still very much the case. Like North Star's like, well, how dare you make assumptions? Because I'm gay. And this is a heated discussion that really was very much going on in the gay community right at that time. If you're gay and a public figure, do you come out of the closet? Because Major Maple Leaf said, well, you're as responsible for killing my son because you had a platform and could have used that to help, and you didn't. And eventually, the blows start to slow down, and they both realize they're on the same side, and they hug, and they find peace. And a few panels later, um, the their North Star's child passes away. But yeah, it's because I mean it's what I found really powerful about this is because coming out of the '80s when you had Reagan, calling it gay cancer
I was
and
gonna say, yeah.
yeah, actively defunding research into it. You had stars like Ellen in the '90s losing their career for a
Yeah.
good long time after
Mhm.
coming out. It was a there's a valid argument to be made on remaining in the closet for a lot of people, um, if that's how they feel safe, because it wasn't safe. But there's a valid argument for coming out if you're in a position of power. So it was an interesting issue that covered a lot of really difficult questions and didn't give an answer, which is what I think was important. It just sort of these are the quandaries that exist for queer
Yeah.
people in 1992.
I,
Yeah,
I
so yeah.
Yeah. I feel like it does best what like really good comic book issues do is where like really speaking to the issue of the time, but in this, like the sci-fi superhero world. But really speaking to, and like you said, it doesn't give you one of those like, why you just need to stand up against injustice. Like, it's like, well, it's more complicated and much more difficult than that. And that in a way is timeless, I think, because we'll see today certain things, like people, if you try and speak out against certain issues, people are still like losing their jobs. um so I think it was very, yeah, I think it was a very thoughtful, like I was like, oh wow, like I forgot that like comics even in the early 90s like were could be really like ahead of the times and really with it.
Yeah, this one very much felt ahead of its time. Mostly just because it dared to talk about this issue that and even going against the grain of like it just it's sad that they never did explore or never really made more of an attempt to explore Northstar's sexuality after this. It was kind of like this is where he says that he was, and they I don't know, like they just felt like they couldn't. But for me, it was also the fact that what kind of got me the most was that Major Maple Leaf came in ready to kill the baby and like fought it with violence because that's how he was expressing his anger towards the situation.
Yeah.
And it
Mm,
came, and I understood where that anger was coming from. I mean, in a way, like Major Maple Leaf was kind of
yes.
the antagonist in this one, but just because he was ready to just beat up Northstar because of the privilege that he has, or at least the privilege that he felt that he had. Um, yeah,
Yeah. And
And
it's
I
this,
mean, sorry,
I
go
was
ahead.
just gonna say, and it's a situation where the heroes and the villains realize that violence isn't the answer. Like as you said, like it's not like there's times where you see like, I mean, we see in all the superhero movies, like you defeat the villain with like blasters or like some sort of violent move, but the idea of like winning by stopping being violent is the way that you defeat the bad thing, or the way that you win. I think is very rare in comics. So that was a really, yeah, really cool.
Yeah, and I mean, like you said, he's an antagonist, but he's not a villain. Like he's
Yes.
there's a core of sympathy there, and his anger too is not entirely misdirected. Like
Hmm.
it's not. I mean, it is towards North Star and the child, but it's a reasonable anger. Like his son is like ignored because he was
Yeah.
gay. His son was just basically washed, like just as he says, a statistic. But and during in the trivia, or sorry, no, in the at the time, that was very much the case. Like you wouldn't hear about AIDS unless it was like this easily framed. It's like, oh, they're living this hedonistic lifestyle, heroin addicts and homosexuals,
Mhm.
or it's this child whose mother was a horrible person and is suffering because of it. It's like this. The reality is, that, blood transfusions and all these different factors could have led to it. But
Mhm.
yeah, it's a compelling
Yeah.
take. I think that was, like you said, very much ahead of its time, Shara.
And I think that anger, when you think of the times, is very justified because, like, this was also the time when, like, Rush Limbaugh would be like celebrating, like, oh, like, white gay people died this week from AIDS and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Like, like there's a lot of like really awful, and he had a huge platform, so like a lot of really awful shit going on. So like, I can get it if someone would just just have this like violent anger coursing through their veins, but just not knowing where to direct it at.
So I have to say the art in this book though is
it
very
feels
90s. It is
Mm,
so
yeah.
90s. Like there's and not necessarily in a bad way. Like Mark Purcell's art. There's some moments where like you see like Major Maple Leaf just on the seat, and like all of these chest hairs like individually drawn.
Yeah.
But then there's other panels where it's in motion and it becomes almost minimalistic in its expression, where
Uh,
there's like little bits that are highly detailed, but everything else is just like speed lines and stuff. But yeah, so is I liked it. It worked. It wasn't like, there's some 90s comic books where you're looking at it and it's like, oh, ugh. This one, it held its own. It wasn't, although there were like a lot of matching outfits for the team.
Mhm.
Like I felt like it's kind of hard to tell who's who unless you really
Mhm.
knew, because they all wore
Uh,
those same. Oh, sorry. This bugged me when I reread it last night. That is the worst drawn maple leaf on their outfit I've ever seen.
yeah.
As a, like a 6-year-old child, I could draw a better maple leaf. It was like a
This is why you
triangle.
need Canadians drawing maple leaves.
Yes, yeah. You're the only ones who can be trusted to responsibly draw maple
Yeah.
leaves. But yeah, yeah,
That's so funny. Yeah, and like I feel like the faded colors ish, like because usually nowadays things are much more like shiny and glossy looking. I read it digitally, but I felt like I could feel the papery
Right? Yeah,
pages.
same
Like,
here.
hmm
I like it gave that kind of it felt like it was right in the 90s. Even like the details on the face, like sometimes Major Maple Leaf kind of gave me like a Freddy Krueger sort of look just because
mm, I
he
can
had
see
yeah,
that.
texture on the
Yeah.
face. Um which is kind of funny, and but in the same way there are still some very powerful frames, like even like the last frame of the book is Northstar holding this baby with Major League just on top,
Mm,
like holding his shoulders, and even
yeah,
though it
yeah.
yeah.
It's two fathers sharing their
absolutely, so
grief.
even though it
And
feels old and
yeah,
feels like that old style, it still has those really it's still very good art and very compelling, like, and it makes me feel, especially in that last really somber scene.
Yeah, like a very emotionally impactful for
Absolutely.
sure. And like even if the art's like advanced since then, like to still like those simple images being very, yeah,
Exactly.
impactful.
yeah. So now you did mention how they didn't talk about North Star sexuality after that, but there were attempts to make that storyline. At one point, they were talking about North Star having AIDS, um, and but that did not happen. He eventually went on. The character went on to marry his publicist, who worked at the ski line that he advertised was like a
Mhm.
sponsor for. But yeah, so he's also one of the first gay marriages in
Wow.
comics as well. So he
Oh
married
This
wow.
and they did
yeah.
talk about it
So
Yeah.
afterwards.
yeah, well, outside in other comics,
Okay.
not in Alpha Flight because Alpha Flight ended, but
That's why
in
I
X Men, he married his long term partner, and
Do you
yeah.
remember roughly when they wrote that when that issue came out?
No, let me see when
Matt's checking
did.
Cerebro.
Yeah, okay, Cerebro, tell me.
Or
North
I
Star.
guess this is
Yeah,
more the Batman
Yeah.
supercomputer, yeah.
yes. June
Oh, wow. I
12. Astonishing
June
X Men
2012, okay,
51.
yeah.
Yeah,
I
which would
think after
be
yeah.
around when that would be around when the is legalized in the states, if I
Right.
remember correctly. So that would be right around that time.
Right, because
Um,
yeah, it would have been Obama around his like just after he got reelected, maybe, or just before.
yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah. He's kind of been at the forefront of these stories. I mean, reading this, there's moments where I'm like, yeah, this was written in the '90s. So I mean, like the Toronto
Mhm.
Terminator. Like no way we would call
Yeah,
him that. Like no. Um, but and using a Mountie while quintessentially Canadian is not so much a thing that we do anymore as a
for sure.
national symbol,
Yes.
because of the problematic nature
But
of that organization.
For
Um,
sure. Or even like dressing.
I will
Oh,
say it
sorry,
is
go ahead.
interesting that they used like an RCMP style looking officer that resorted to kind of violence before resorting to talking about what was making him angry, and that was a sort of
Yeah.
yeah,
fairly modern way of a modern commentary without them knowing obviously the way that we look at them now. But
Yeah.
as you were saying, Dan,
yeah,
sorry.
Well, I was gonna say, and well, also like even just like in the more old school style, because now I think you wouldn't even see an RCMP maybe for a ceremonial reason they would dress up like that. Um, but it's interesting because in Canada you're not really allowed if you're gonna like everyone's afraid of getting sued, so you never have like in a TV show, you won't say like they'll say like Canadian National Police maybe, but they wouldn't say like Canadian Mounted Police if they're doing, because there's a show called Allegiance, I think it's called now, and they have that like critique of like the RCMP, but they don't say RCMP. It's called something else, but it's kind of like, all right, if you know Canada, this is the RCMP. Wink, wink. They're
And,
corrupt.
and here's the thing: Disney owns the merchandising rights to the
What?
RCMP.
Is it because of like Dudley Do Right or like?
They no, they so they s- I think they licensed them to Disney or something
Oh,
to
really?
for merchandising. Uh, it's
Wow.
weird. Like so, yeah. The RCMP, litigious for not just as a police organization, but as a PR entity. But B, they got the mouse behind their the mouse has got their back.
Wow.
So yeah, you don't cross.
Yeah. You don't cross the RCMP. Ha ha.
Yeah, yeah,
That's some
yeah.
trivia I did-
So I have.
that was some trivia I
Sorry,
did
go ahead.
not think I was going to learn today at all.
Yeah, me neither.
Yeah, this is the weird stuff that's stuck in my head since the '90s.
Yeah.
So I do have an interesting quote. There was an interview with Byrne, um, where it's like he was asked, "What was it your intent when you created Northstar that he should be a gay man?" And John replied, "When I created Alpha Flight, they were basically a half dozen characters who could survive a prolonged battle with the X-Men. They had very little depth, though I am a compulsive creator of backstory, so I knew something about their histories then, and they were not really created with any thought towards eventually getting their own title. Unfortunately, they proved enormously popular, and so Marvel began pushing me to make an Alpha Flight book. Eventually, I relented and I agreed to do the series, which meant I had one problem instantly. I had to find some ways to make these characters more three dimensional. One thing that popped up immediately into my mind was to make one of them gay. I had recently read an article from in Scientific American on what was then the early 80s fairly radical new thinking on just what process caused a person to become homosexual, and the evidence was pointing increasingly to being genetic and not environmental factors. So I thought it seemed like a time for a gay superhero. And since I was being
Mm.
forced to make Alpha Flight a real series, I might as well make one of them gay. From there, it was a process of elimination. I didn't want to make the homosexual to be one of the girls, since that was something people tended to associate, rightly or wrongly, with Claremont books. Mac Hudson and Heather were happily married. I didn't want, oh, sorry, it's Mac Hudson, not John.
Yeah.
Mac Hudson and Heather were happily married, and I didn't want to mess with that. Michael was a widow with a daughter, and that way lay what I considered too much cliche. Uh, if he turned out to be gay, sorry, and that way lay what I considered too much of a cliche if he turned out to be gay. Besides, as a native Canadian, he was already a resident minority. The new guy, Puck, had his own set of problems. Sasquatch would just be too damn scary, so I settled on Jean Paul. And in
Mm.
that moment, I I realized it was already there. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I must have been considering making him gay before I decided to do so. Of course, the temper of the times, the powers that were, and naturally the comics code would not let me come right out and state Jean Paul was homosexual, but I managed to get the word out even with those barriers. And that's from a August 2004 interview.
Oh wow.
So yeah, so it's interesting. Like he was gay before he was even on the page in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And him mentioning that before, because that 2004 is before gay marriage was even
Yeah,
legalized in Canada.
Yeah.
Um. So
yeah,
yeah.
very, very ahead of its time.
Wow.
I'm glad that at the end of the day, for me, that just means that he had these characters, and even though they didn't get to explore a lot about their lives, or maybe they did, like I like that he always had it in the back of his mind of who people were and what they were
Hmm.
coming from, and I think in storytelling in general, that's always important.
Yeah,
I agree.
and I mean, John Byrne is actually, being a very queer, uh, positive um, artist from day one. Like his earliest comic book or comic that was published was called Gay Guy. He wrote it when
Huh.
he was in college, and it was part of the campus newspaper, and it was sort of flipping tropes about art students being gay by the jocks and the engineers and stuff, especially in Alberta. Um,
Wow.
so yeah, but he really, it was something that was very important to him. Is something that's sort of driven a lot of his work, which I find really interesting. Because you don't, I mean, creators bring their own voice, their own history and stories, and it's often we don't necessarily know that, especially in comic books where they're so
Yeah,
minimized.
I think that
Yeah.
oh, and this kind of goes into a story. Like I actually have met Scott Lobdell, like the writer for this particular story.
Oh,
Oh,
Knowing
cool.
cool.
the writer, or at least like having some familiarity with it, totally frames how you go into reading a story as well. So I met Scott, and like if I went like, hey Scott, like, he would not know who I am. But
Mm.
met him at Fan Expo last year, or 2 years ago. Sorry. In Fan Expo was my first ever convention that I ever had gone to, and if you ever have been to a convention, especially Fan Expo, it's very overwhelming. There are people everywhere, and they're all dressed up,
Yeah.
so it's a very overwhelming thing. And I think by the kind of close to the end of the day, I was feeling very burnt out in a way. My social battery got very low. But I know that I was kind of on the search for the Visions comics. Because I wanted to get into it. I wanted to learn about Vivian Vision. We've talked about it on the podcast before, so I was like, okay, I'm gonna look for this this comic, and then I go to the comic section of the Fan Expo, and Scott was there, but I thought that he like worked there because I didn't really get that he was a comic book guy. So I felt kind of bad because I was like, hey, like, do you know where do you guys have the Visions comics? So I was asking him about a comic book that he didn't even write, and he was like, oh well. Oh, I don't know. He was like, yeah, probably somewhere in here. And I was like, okay, cool. And I just felt too overwhelmed, and I kind of went away. And then my friends and I were kind of walking throughout, and then somebody taps us on our shoulder, and we turn around, and it's Scott Lobdell, and he's holding 3 Visions
Mm.
comics in front of me. And I'm like, what? And he's like, I found these for you. Like, if you want, like, you can look through them. And I'm like, what? And
Oh,
it was like the
cool.
cheapest one.
Oh.
And he was like, and I was explaining to him, like, I want to do some research on the character, like it's a really cool character I might want to write one day. And he was like, that's fantastic, you know what, like, why don't you take the comic for free? And I was like, no, you don't have to do that. He's like, no, you know what, go, like, you know what, let me give you this comic for free. And the writer is Tom King, and the like artist writer is Tom King, and he's here. He's at the Fan Expo. So why don't you, like, I'll give you the comic for free, so you can go pay and get it signed by Tom King. And I was like, okay, cool, that's very sweet. So that's
Oh.
my very sweet Scott. I would
Very
love to,
cool.
if I go back to Fan Expo, I want to go back and say thank you to him, because he was,
Oh, wow.
yeah.
Oh,
And then
that's
I met
cool.
Tom King, and it wasn't as pleasant as that. So
Oh,
I think that
no.
Oh.
at least going into Alpha Flight, I kind of knew that Scott was a quite nice guy. So that yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
cool. Scott Lobdell,
If
you hear this? Listen to this episode so you can find out.
Yeah, you are a nice dude,
yeah, it
and
was
we
Yeah.
appreciate
very
it.
solid.
And you wrote a good comic set in
Absolutely.
Canada.
Very much so. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's my Scott Lobdell story.
Oh, that's
Well,
very cool.
I think we can't top that story. I think that's the best way to go out. So since this is Canada, I will not use my regular sign off. I'll say good day, eh?
Hey, Excelsior, eh?
You've been listening to Detecting the Marvelous, a Far From Here and ShowbizMonkeys.com co-production. Your producers are Dan Rosen, Matt Erdill, and Shahara Ghaznavi. Music by Glenn Bouchamp, and art by Ben Steamroller. Thanks for listening, and remember, true believers, Excelsior!